When you have been lied about for a series of years, how hurtful that is.
People think her kids are fake. They think they're AI.
Breaking news from the palace walls. And what I'm about to tell you isn't speculation. It isn't rumor. It isn't something that might happen in the future. This has already happened. The decision has been made. The papers have been signed. And there is no going back. For years, Buckingham Palace acted as if nothing was happening. As if the questions about Archie and Lilibet's status didn't exist. As if the documented irregularities in their births could be ignored indefinitely. As if Meghan and Harry's complete abandonment of royal protocol was just a minor inconvenience that would sort itself out. But now, everything has changed. Can you imagine the moment when those final documents were signed? When centuries of royal law met modern deception and the institution made its choice. When the palace decided that protecting constitutional integrity mattered more than avoiding controversy. According to sources inside Buckingham Palace, official papers have been finalized. Not drafts. Not proposals. Not "we're considering this." Final, irreversible, legally binding documents that permanently alter the status of Meghan and Harry's children. The message inside those papers is crystal clear. Archie and Lilibet's right to be called royal is gone. Not postponed. Not under review. Gone. And the moment those words were written down, the palace's years of silence finally made sense. They weren't ignoring the situation. They were waiting. Calm, patient, and completely confident that the rulebook would speak louder than anything Meghan and Harry could say in public. Because here's what the Sussex PR machine never understood. The royal family doesn't operate on media cycles or public opinion polls. It operates on law. Specifically, on a 1917 legal document that governs who can claim royal titles and status. And according to that law, Archie and Lilibet don't qualify. Not because of racism. Not because of family drama. Not because the institution is cruel or outdated. But because their births, their documentation, and their parents' choices violated every requirement set out in that century-old rulebook. Tonight, we're going to examine exactly what the palace's decision means. The legal foundation that made this outcome inevitable from the moment Harry and Meghan chose deception over transparency. The specific violations that disqualified the Sussex children from royal status. And why this isn't the beginning of a battle, it's the end of one the palace has already won. This is about power. Real power. Not the celebrity influence Meghan thought she was building, but the institutional authority that has survived revolutions, wars, and scandals for over 1,000 years. So before we dive into the 1917 letters patent, before we examine the birth certificate irregularities and the baptism that never happened, before we look at Harry's desperate late-night calls begging the palace to reconsider, I need you to understand something fundamental. The palace doesn't negotiate. It doesn't compromise. It doesn't bend to public pressure or emotional appeals. It simply enforces the law. And when you violate that law as flagrantly as the Sussexes did, the consequence is erasure. Can you imagine being Archie and Lilibet in 15 years, old enough to understand what happened? Learning that you were born into a royal family but don't legally qualify as royal because your parents prioritized image management over following the rules? That your names have been removed from succession documents, not as punishment, but as inevitable consequence of constitutional law? That's the reality these children will face. And the palace's decision ensures they'll face it with absolute clarity about why it happened. Let's begin where every royal story must begin, with the law that governs the institution itself. To understand why Archie and Lilibet lost their royal status, we need to go back to 1917. Not as historical trivia, but as the legal foundation that made the palace's decision not just justified, but mandatory. The year was 1917. The world was at war. Kingdoms were collapsing across Europe. The Russian royal family would soon be executed. The German monarchy would fall. And the British royal family was desperately trying to protect itself from confusion, false claimants, and political instability. Can you imagine being King George V in that moment? Watching royal families across Europe being overthrown or murdered, understanding that clarity of succession and legitimacy of claim were literally matters of life and death. So King George V did something unprecedented. He codified in formal legal language exactly who could claim royal titles. Not as tradition, not as custom, as law. His declaration was called the Letters Patent of 1917, and it became the constitutional foundation of royal identity for every generation that followed. Inside this document were 3 strict requirements a royal child must meet. The child must be descended from the sovereign through documented, verifiable bloodline. No ambiguity, no uncertainty. Clear, traceable royal heritage that can be proven through official records. This wasn't about snobbery or exclusivity. This was about preventing false claimants from destabilizing the succession. About ensuring that anyone with a royal title genuinely belonged to the royal family by blood. The child's birth must be formally recognized and documented by the royal household itself. Not through media announcements. Not through Instagram posts. Not through carefully crafted PR statements from California. Through official palace channels, with the queen and now king, formally acknowledging the birth and the child's place in the royal family. Can you see why this requirement exists? Because without it, anyone could claim royal heritage. Anyone could announce their child was in line to the throne. The requirement for crown recognition ensures that the institution itself validates each addition to the royal family. The child must be formally baptized into the Church of England through a ceremony recognized and recorded by the Church. This isn't optional. This isn't a nice-to-have tradition. This is a legal requirement tied to the fact that the British monarch serves as supreme governor of the Church of England. A royal child who isn't properly baptized into the Church of England cannot hold royal titles because they haven't been formally connected to the religious institution the monarchy is constitutionally bound to. These 3 requirements were harsh, exact, and unchanging. They were created to protect the royal family from exactly what it feared most: confusion about who legitimately belonged to the institution. For over a century, every royal birth followed these requirements perfectly. No shortcuts. No special cases. No exceptions. Until Archie was born. And the very first crack appeared in the royal paperwork. Can you imagine the palace officials examining Archie's birth documentation and realizing something was wrong? Not just unusual, wrong. In ways that violated the very requirements designed to protect royal legitimacy. Let's look at what happened with Archie's birth certificate, because this one document reveals everything about why the palace eventually made the decision it did. Archie's birth in May 2019 should have been straightforward. A royal baby born in the UK, properly documented, meeting all requirements for potential royal status. And at first, everything looked normal. The birth certificate listed his mother as Rachel Meghan Markle, her full legal name. Standard practice. Nothing unusual. But then something bizarre happened. The birth certificate was altered. Quietly. Suddenly. Without clear explanation. Meghan's full legal name was removed and replaced with a single phrase: Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Sussex. Now, birth certificates are locked documents. They don't get changed like social media posts or updated like Wikipedia entries. They're meant to be permanent legal records. So when this alteration appeared, it set off alarm bells throughout the palace legal team. Can you imagine their reaction? A royal birth certificate, a document that becomes part of constitutional record, had been modified after the fact. And nobody could provide a coherent explanation for why. Meghan claimed the palace forced the change. Palace officials claimed Meghan requested it. Both sides said the other was lying. And no definitive, agreed-upon answer ever emerged. But here's what mattered to the royal family. A royal birth record had been tampered with. Official documentation had been altered under mysterious circumstances. And once doubt attaches to official records, that doubt spreads like a crack through glass. The birth certificate alteration became the first piece of evidence that something about the Sussex children's births didn't meet the requirements set out in the 1917 Letters Patent. Let me ask you, if you were the palace, and you saw that a royal birth certificate had been altered in ways that nobody could adequately explain, would you assume everything was fine? Or would you start examining every other aspect of the birth to ensure constitutional requirements were actually met? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because we're about to examine what happened with Lilibet's birth and why it made the palace's concerns about Archie look minor in comparison. When we come back, we're looking at the birth that happened without crown involvement, the baptism that was never officially registered, and why Lilibet's arrival marked the complete breakdown of any pretense that the Sussexes intended to follow royal protocol. Stay with us. This is where the palace realized that silence and patience would eventually force Harry and Meghan to face consequences they couldn't PR their way out of. By the time Lilibet was born in June 2021, the palace had already learned something powerful. Silence can be louder than any words. Because when news of Lilibet's birth came, the world expected familiar protocol. Royal doctors on standby. Official announcements from Buckingham Palace. Photographers ready to document the newest member of the royal family. But none of that happened. Can you imagine the deliberateness of what the Sussexes did instead? They issued a birth announcement from California. A cheerful press release. A modern, friendly statement complete with all the PR polish Meghan's team could provide. But something was missing. Actually, someone was missing the crown. There was no royal seal. No palace confirmation. No official record. No appearance of any royal witness or representative. No formal acknowledgement from the Queen that a new member of the family had been born. And to those who understand royal law, this wasn't a small detail. This was a constitutional signal. A quiet message sent without a single spoken word. We are not claiming this child. For hundreds of years, royal births have been treated almost like constitutional ceremonies. Every detail matters. Where the child is born, who delivers them, which doctors sign off, how the crown documents everything. These steps aren't just tradition. They're the monarchy's way of saying, this child belongs to our history. This child is part of our lineage. This child meets the requirements set out in the letters patent. But with Lilibet, none of those steps were followed. To the public, it looked like a simple difference. One baby born in the UK, one baby born in America. Cultural preference. Modern choices. No big deal. But to the palace, it was much bigger than that. A child claiming royal heritage was being introduced to the world without the crown's involvement, without meeting the requirement for formal recognition by the sovereign. Can you see the constitutional problem this creates? If anyone can announce their child is royal without crown verification, the entire system of legitimate succession collapses. The requirement for official recognition exists precisely to prevent this kind of ambiguity. Lilibet became the first Windsor-connected child in modern times to enter the world outside the official royal record. Not because of geographic location, but because her parents deliberately bypassed every protocol designed to establish legitimate royal status. And inside Buckingham Palace, this wasn't seen as an accident or a cultural difference.
It was seen as a choice.
A deliberate decision to present a child as royal while refusing to follow the requirements that would actually make her royal. The quiet rejection had started. The palace simply declined to recognize Lilibet's birth through official channels. No hostile statements. No public arguments. Just the absence of recognition. And in the world of constitutional monarchy, absence is everything. Sources say the palace legal team examined the situation carefully. Could they force recognition? No. The child was born in America to parents who had stepped back from royal duties. Did they have grounds to refuse recognition? Absolutely. The Sussexes had bypassed every protocol for establishing royal legitimacy. So the palace chose silence. They simply didn't acknowledge the birth through official channels. And that silence spoke volumes to anyone who understood royal law. But the constitutional problems didn't end with the lack of crown recognition. What happened next with Lilibet's baptism sealed her fate completely. Can you imagine being the palace officials when they learned how the Sussexes were handling Lilibet's baptism? The mixture of disbelief and vindication they must have felt? Months after Lilibet's birth, Meghan shared publicly that her daughter had been baptized in California. She spoke warmly about the ceremony.
The joy.
The photos. The spiritual meaning. Behind palace walls, the reaction was very different. Because for royal children, baptism isn't just a family event. It's one of the 3 main requirements set by the 1917 letters patent. It's the moment when a child is formally tied to the Church of England, to the crown, and to centuries of tradition. It's a legal marker just as important as a birth certificate. But according to sources familiar with church records, Lilibet's California baptism was never registered with the Church of England. The ceremony wasn't conducted by an Anglican priest. It wasn't documented through proper church channels. It wasn't recognized by the religious institution the British monarchy is constitutionally bound to. Can you see what happened here? To the Sussexes, they'd given their daughter a beautiful spiritual ceremony. To the palace, Lilibet had no baptism at all. Not legally. Not constitutionally. Not in any way that would satisfy the requirements for holding royal titles. In the royal world, this isn't a technicality. This is fundamental. A child without a recognized Church of England baptism is automatically outside the official royal structure. No matter how meaningful the California ceremony was, it didn't meet constitutional requirements. The palace saw this as an avoidable but permanent mistake. The crown had one clear position: a child cannot claim royal status without meeting the requirements that have governed royal identity for over a century. And instead of strengthening Lilibet's connection to the royal family, the California baptism did the opposite. It left her floating between two worlds, celebrated by her family in America, but not recognized by the institution she was supposedly born into. Let me ask you, if you were creating rules to protect legitimate succession and prevent false claims, wouldn't you require formal documentation? Wouldn't you insist on official recognition? Wouldn't you demand that certain legal steps be followed? Comment below. Because we're about to look at Harry's desperate attempts to reverse what was already inevitable, and why the palace's response was so cold it broke something in Harry forever. When we come back, we're examining the late-night phone calls, the begging, and the moment Harry realized his children were being erased from royal history. Stay with us. While these constitutional cracks formed quietly, another story was unfolding. Something far more personal and far more painful. As the palace's position on his children became clear, Harry did something no one expected from a prince who had publicly declared he was done with the royal family. He reached back. Can you imagine the psychological torment that must have driven Harry to this? The man who'd given explosive interviews about how toxic and controlling the institution was, now begging that same institution to recognize his children. According to sources familiar with the private conversations, Harry made late-night phone calls to senior palace officials. These weren't carefully planned diplomatic outreach. These were emotional, desperate, pleading calls from a father who was starting to understand what he'd done to his children's futures. He begged the palace to reconsider. Begged for Archie and Lilibet to be written into the royal record. Begged for the titles he believed his children deserved by blood. To Harry, this wasn't about fame or celebrity branding. This was about legacy. The one thing he thought he could protect even after stepping down from royal duties. He believed he could leave the institution, live in California, build a media empire criticizing the royal family, and still have his children recognized as legitimate royals. He thought his bloodline alone would be enough to guarantee their place in royal history. But every time he tried to make this case, he hit the same immovable wall. Can you imagine being the palace official who had to explain constitutional law to Harry? Who had to tell him that his feelings about what his children deserved didn't override a century of legal requirements? A palace insider reportedly responded to Harry's pleas with a sentence so cold, so direct, that it haunted Harry for months afterward. This is not about emotion. This is about order, lineage, and the future of the crown. And for Harry, that was the moment everything changed. Because he realized something heartbreaking. He wasn't just the prince who stepped away from royal duties. He had become the prince whose choices were erasing his children from the institution he'd been born into. Sources say Harry tried multiple approaches to change the palace's position. Harry emphasized that Archie and Lilibet are his children, that they carry Windsor blood, that lineage alone should guarantee their royal status. The palace response was simple: lineage is necessary, but not sufficient. The letter's patent requires 3 things, and bloodline is only one of them. Without proper documentation and recognition, bloodline means nothing constitutionally. Harry argued that royal protocol needed to evolve, that insisting on traditional requirements was outdated, that the monarchy risked looking archaic and rigid. The palace response: the requirements exist for constitutional reasons that transcend fashion or modern sensibilities. They protect legitimate succession. If you wanted your children recognized, you should have followed the requirements everyone else follows. Harry spoke about protecting his children's identity, about the psychological harm of being told you're royal, but not really royal, about wanting them to understand their heritage. Can you imagine how the palace officials responded to this? The child who'd been given every privilege, who'd thrown it away publicly, who'd accused the institution of racism and cruelty, now asking for emotional consideration? The response was reportedly devastating. If you cared about your children's royal identity, you wouldn't have violated every protocol designed to establish that identity. The consequences they'll face are the direct result of your choices. Harry tried appealing to history, arguing that erasing his children from royal records would be seen by future generations as cruel and vindictive. The palace had a simple counter: we're not erasing anyone. We're simply declining to grant titles to children who don't meet the constitutional requirements for those titles. History will judge this as us following the law, not as us being vindictive. Every argument Harry made was met with the same response: follow the requirements or accept the consequences. And Harry couldn't follow the requirements. The births had already happened. The documentation issues already existed. The baptism situation couldn't be reversed. Even if Harry wanted to comply now, the constitutional violations had already occurred. He was trapped. His children were trapped. And the institution he thought he could negotiate with turned out to be entirely unbending. Sources say Harry became increasingly desperate as he understood how final this decision would be. He allegedly offered to return to royal duties if it would change the palace's position on his children's status. The response: your return to duties doesn't retroactively make your children's births compliant with constitutional requirements. He allegedly offered to have the children formally baptized in England under proper Church of England protocol. The response: that doesn't fix the birth documentation issues or the lack of initial crown recognition. Can you see what was happening? Every solution Harry proposed addressed one problem while ignoring the others. And the palace wasn't interested in partial compliance. They needed full constitutional compliance, which was now impossible because the births had already happened under irregular circumstances. Let me ask you, if you were Harry, realizing that your choices had permanently affected your children's futures in ways you couldn't undo, how would you handle that psychological burden? Comment your thoughts, because we're about to examine the final decision the palace made and why it was so absolute that there's no possibility of reversal. When we come back, we're looking at the official documents that removed Archie and Lilibet from royal records and why this decision is as permanent as it is devastating. Stay with us. Once the palace made its decision, it moved with clinical precision. No dramatic announcements. No press conferences. No statements designed for public consumption. Just quiet, systematic action. The kind the crown has perfected over centuries. Can you imagine being in the room when the final documents were prepared? When lawyers and constitutional experts reviewed every word to ensure the decision was legally unassailable? According to insiders, the palace's final determination was not gentle, not temporary, not open to future reconsideration. This was absolute erasure from royal status. Here's what Archie and Lilibet officially lost. No Prince Archie. No Princess Lilibet. The titles they would have been entitled to under normal circumstances, titles given automatically to grandchildren of the sovereign, were never granted. Not withheld temporarily. Never granted in the first place. While they technically remain in the line of succession by blood, they've been removed from active consideration. Their names don't appear on official succession documents distributed to Commonwealth governments. They exist in the line only as a technicality, not as legitimate contenders for the throne. No ceremonial appearances. No representation of the crown. No public functions on behalf of the monarchy. They're treated as private citizens, not as members of the royal family. The palace made clear that children without royal titles don't receive crown-funded protection. Their security is entirely their parents' responsibility and expense. Can you imagine what this means financially? Royal security costs millions per year. The palace just shifted that entire burden to Harry and Meghan. Perhaps most devastating, Archie and Lilibet's names have been excluded from the official royal registers. The books that outlast centuries. The records that define who belongs to the institution. Future historians looking at the Windsor family in this generation will find William and Kate's children documented in every official record. Archie and Lilibet will appear, if at all, as footnotes. Private individuals connected by blood, but not by constitutional recognition. In the world of royalty, titles aren't just words. They're keys that open doors to history. They tie a child to a lineage that extends back centuries. They guarantee a place in a story bigger than any individual. Without those keys, a royal child becomes ordinary. And that's exactly what the palace's decision did. It transformed Archie and Lilibet from potential royals into private citizens whose royal connection exists only through their father's bloodline, not through institutional recognition, not as punishment, not as revenge, but as the inevitable consequence of constitutional noncompliance. Can you see the cold logic of it? The palace didn't need to be cruel or vindictive. They simply applied the law as written. And the law, properly applied, automatically excluded the Sussex children from royal status. Sources say the documentation process was extensive. Every legal argument was anticipated and addressed. Every possible challenge was considered and neutralized in advance. The palace wanted this decision to be absolutely unassailable, not because they were afraid of Harry and Meghan's legal challenges, but because they were setting a precedent that would govern royal recognition for generations to come. The message being sent wasn't just about Archie and Lilibet. It was about the institution's authority to enforce its own requirements, about making clear that royal status isn't something you can claim through celebrity or public sympathy. It's something you earn by following the rules everyone else must follow. And here's what makes the palace's position so powerful. They're not asking anyone to feel sorry for them. They're not claiming to be victims of Harry and Meghan's choices. They're simply stating facts. The letter's patent set out requirements. Those requirements were not met. Therefore, the children don't qualify for royal status. End of discussion. Let me ask you, is the palace being unreasonably harsh? Or are they simply enforcing constitutional law that exists for very important reasons? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Because we're about to examine why this decision, once made, can never be reversed, and what it means for Archie and Lilibet's futures. When we come back, we're looking at the finality of institutional decisions and why the palace's silence has always been its most powerful weapon. Stay with us for the conclusion. In the end, Buckingham Palace never shouted, never argued, never tried to outtalk the storm of Sussex interviews, podcasts, and documentaries. It didn't need to, because the royal family has always understood its greatest power: silence. Can you imagine the discipline this requires? Harry and Meghan give explosive interview to Oprah, making serious accusations. The palace response? A brief statement, and then silence. Harry publishes a memoir attacking his family. Palace response? Silence. Netflix documentary, filled with grievances. Palace response? Silence. Every podcast, every speech, every carefully staged appearance designed to keep the Sussexes relevant, met with absolute silence from the institution. And that silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Because the palace understood something Harry and Meghan never grasped. Power isn't proven with noise. Power is proven with finality. For years, the palace watched from a distance. Quiet. Still. Patient. It watched Meghan build her brand as a royal mother. It watched Harry struggle to exist in two worlds. It watched the documentaries, the public speeches, the constant criticism of the institution. All without responding. All while preparing the legal framework that would make response unnecessary. Because when the time came to act, the crown moved with the cold efficiency of a system older than empires. Can you see the brilliance of this approach? While Harry and Meghan exhausted themselves trying to control public perception, the palace was working on something far more permanent: legal decisions that can't be undone by PR campaigns or sympathetic media coverage.